Anglo-Saxon kings, there was no such thing as primogeniture, the automatic succession of the eldest son. The crown passed firstly to the king's second son, William Rufus, next to his third son, Henry I, and finally to his grandson, Stephen. Both on the first and second occasions, it should have gone to William's eldest son, Robert, and on the last to the conqueror's granddaughter, the Empress Matilda, and her son, the future Henry II. When he died in 1087, William left Normandy to Robert and chose his second surviving son, William, to rule England. He was later nicknamed Rufus, most likely on account of his red hair. Many of the nobles consequently found themselves serving two masters, having lands in both countries. This decision of the conqueror to split his inheritance was not light, and soon after his accession, William Rufus was faced with a rebellion led by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, designed to put Robert on the throne. It was crushed. Indeed, William Rufus was even more savage than his father. He was a monarch who lived entirely for the battlefield, on which he was fearless. Greedy and immoral, he meted out strong justice and eliminated anyone who defied him. He exacted from his tenants-in-chief everything he could, large fines on the succession of an heir to an estate, the right to custody of that heir, and his lands, if he was not of age, and also the right of disposing of any heiress in marriage. All of these measures were used to exact money. William's deadliest foe was the church, for which he had little time, being, unlike his father, far from pious. When a bishop or an abbot died, William, instead of appointing a new one, left the post vacant and took over the revenues for the crown. As a result, the church denounced him as a monster, but under him, the Norman rule of England was consolidated. When he was accidentally killed while hunting in the New Forest in August 1100, it was seen by many, not surprisingly, as the judgment of God on a wicked tyrant. William Rufus never married, and on his death the crown should have passed to his elder brother Robert, but that did not happen. William's younger brother Henry happened to be part of the fatal hunting party, and within days he seized the royal treasury and had himself crowned king. During his reign, the system created by William I reached its climax, and once again, that it did so was a direct reflection of the qualities of the king, for he too was a cruel and violent man who spent his life either fighting or hunting. When he snatched the crown, he issued a charter, promising the barons that he would make amends for the deeds of his brother, but it meant nothing. To win the English, he married an Anglo-Saxon princess, descended from Alfred, but that too meant little. Henry continued his brother's policy of exacting everything also saw the development of the Exchequer, when a committee met during the king's frequent absences abroad to oversee and audit accounts. Henry, however, was afflicted by a major problem. His only son William was drowned at sea crossing to Normandy. Although he had married again, there was no son, so that he was left only with a daughter, Matilda, who was married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. Henry I's last years were clouded by all the problems of securing his daughter's succession. Firstly, her husband died, and she was left childless. She returned to her father's court, where Henry summoned all his tenants-in-chief and made them swear to acknowledge her as his successor. His hope was then to obtain a grandson, and so he married her off to a man 10 years her junior, Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. Matilda herself was arrogant and by no means popular with the king's vassals. To this unpopularity was now added a man who ruled over a state which was Normandy's enemy. The Angevins and the Normans had always fought each other, and now the latter were faced with the possibility of the leader of their traditional foe being the king. They did not like it. All of this explains why, when Henry I died in December 1135, no one opposed the crown being seized by Stephen, the son of the conqueror's daughter, Adela, Countess of Blois. Stephen had always been a favourite of his uncle, who made him the greatest landowner in England, but he lacked the attributes of a strong king. Affable, popular and generous, he was a good knight, but he did not know how to wield the rod of iron which was essential to keep the unruly barons in order. The result was anarchy. Some of the barons went over to Matilda, others were loyal to Stephen. Worse, in the absence of firm royal power, the barons began to fight private wars with each other. A monk records what this means for the people of England. When the traitors saw that Stephen was a good-humoured, kindly and easy-going man who inflicted no punishment, then they committed all manner of horrible crimes. They had done him homage and sworn oaths of fealty to him, but not one of their oaths was kept. They were all forsworn, and their oaths broken. For every great man built him castles, and helped them against the king. And they filled the whole land with these castles, and when the castles were built, they filled them with devils and wicked men. Never did a country endure greater misery, and never did the heathen act more vilely than they did. For over 2 decades, England was devastated. Stephen had lost control. In the end, the barons began to look with more and more favour on the Angevins, and in 1144, Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, conquered Normandy. 5 years later, he passed the duchy on to his son by Matilda. Henry, the new Duke of Normandy, was both shrewd and intelligent. On his father's death, he gained Anjou, and then, the following year, he married a great heiress, Eleanor, who brought Aquitaine. At the age of 19, Henry was already the ruler of a large part of western France. Next, he began to threaten Stephen by attacks on England. Stephen's only son died, and bowing to the inevitable, he adopted Henry as his heir a year before his own death in 1154. Henry came to the throne as the first of a new dynasty, the Plantagenets. shepherd of their flock. They then did homage to the king and received their lands in the same way as any of his lieutenants in chief. By the close of the 11th century, the church was undergoing a revolution, asserting the dignity of the priestly office and the power of the popes as direct successors of Christ through St. Peter. Bishops and abbots were henceforth to be appointed for their spiritual leadership, and not because they would be capable royal officials. Running the government. Okay, I'm just gonna go back to this image. So this is a 14th century royal family tree, and it depicts Henry I with below an inset scene of the loss of his son William in the White Ship, which foundered on its journey to England in November 1120. When told, the king fell senseless to the ground with grief. They were no longer to purchase their positions. All of this struggle to separate the church from the control of the state was to become focused on the one act of the king giving the office holder his staff and ring. Even before 1066, the Pope had forbidden this, but it was to take many years before his decision was to become fact. In England, it first surfaced in 1093, when William Rufus, thinking he was dying, filled the vacant see of Canterbury with a learned and saintly man, Anselm, abbot of the monastery of Bec in Normandy. Anselm refused to be invested by William, and both king and archbishop appealed to Rome, beginning what was to be a never-ending series of disputes. In the reign of Henry I, a compromise was reached. The king no longer gave the cleric his ring and staff, but retained the right to receive his homage. But neither side was happy. When Anselm died in 1109, Henry left the see empty for 5 years. At the same time that the battle lines were being drawn between clergy and laity, the church was undergoing other dramatic developments. This was a golden age for monasticism. Between 1066 and 1154, the number of religious houses rose from 48 to nearly 300, with most belonging to the new reforming orders. Of these, the Cistercians were to leave the imposing monuments we see today in the ruined abbeys, for example of Tintern or Fountains. The Cistercians were reformers who sought out the most desolate and remote valleys where they farmed the land and built their austere churches. In contrast to the rich splendour of the Benedictines, the interiors were devoid of decoration, and the emphasis was on simplicity. The monks were dressed as angels might be, in habits of undyed wool, and lived a life of poverty. Simultaneously, with this passionate revival of monastic life, celibacy was enforced upon the clergy. Both before and after the conquest, priests Sicily, South Italy, and probably Spain. He knew Latin, Greek, and Arabic, and spent his life translating books on philosophy and science, which were to open up new avenues of thought. Not only were universities such as Oxford emerging as centres of learning, but also grammar schools for members of the laity. Soon it was realised that to be educated not only opened up a career in the church, but increasingly elsewhere. Neither the king nor his nobles learned to read or write, for they kept secretaries. As the government became more complicated, it called for men who were educated. What were parts of the royal household gradually began to take on the character of what was later to be government departments. The royal chapel provided church services for the court, but as its clerics were literate, they, under the chancellor, did the paperwork of government. The chamber included the private and sleeping apartments of the king, and came under the chamberlain and the treasurer. The king still kept some of his money under the royal bed, but most of it was in the treasury. The accounts were done twice a year in the exchequer, called after the checkerboard, a table resembling a chessboard on which addition and subtraction could be demonstrated. Afterwards, the accounts were written up on a huge roll of parchment. The earliest surviving one is from 1130, and the system continued almost until Queen Victoria's time. So let's just take a quick look at this photograph at the top. So this is the Cellarium of Fountains, the Great Cistercian Abbey, where ruins now form part of the grounds of Studley Royal, Yorkshire. Fountains was founded in 1132 and rebuilt in the second half of that century after a fire. Royal government was active in the form of justices on tour, holding court all over the country. The direct ancestor of our assize courts. In each shire the king was represented by a sheriff, whose duty it was to see that taxes were collected and delivered to the exchequer. The country was in fact becoming more prosperous by royal grant. Fairs began to be held, and as trade and industry developed, guilds were formed in the cities and towns. By 1130, weavers' guilds existed in London and 4 other towns, reflecting the importance of the wool trade, particularly the export of wool itself to Flanders, where it was woven into fine cloth. It was during this period, too, that the warrior became first and foremost the knight. This was a society about and for men, in which women did not figure beyond influence, although they could be highly educated. A knight was a man of gentle birth, trained in the martial arts, whose role was devotion to Holy Church and to justice. War was his profession,